The text arrived at 9:47 a.m. on Thanksgiving morning, 3 hours before I was supposed to arrive at Mom's house. James, stop pretending to be successful on LinkedIn. It's embarrassing for the whole family. Just admit you're struggling like the rest of us and get a normal job. I stared at my phone while sitting in my sparsely furnished apartment in San Francisco. The irony wasn't lost on me. Tomorrow morning, NeuralSync Technologies would go public. My company, the one I'd founded in this exact apartment 7 years ago with $8,000 in savings and a revolutionary approach to brain-computer interfaces. But James didn't know that. None of them did. I'd kept it quiet deliberately. After years of being dismissed at every family gathering, mocked for my computer games, and asked when I'd get a real career, I'd simply stopped explaining. It was easier to let them think I was struggling than to constantly defend my choices to people who would never understand. The underwhelming responses to my work had started early. When I was 23 and dropped out of my engineering PhD program to pursue my startup idea, Dad had said, "You're throwing away your future for some fantasy." When I was 26 and living on ramen while coding 18-hour days, Mom told her friends I was going through a difficult phase. When I turned 30 and was still working on what they called my hobby, James started introducing me as my brother who never really figured things out. I typed back a simple response, "See you at 1 p.m. The drive to Mom's house in Sacramento took 90 minutes. I spent most of it on calls with my legal team, finalizing last-minute IPO details. The NASDAQ opening bell would ring at 6:30 a.m. Pacific tomorrow. Initial projections valued the company at $3.2 billion. My personal stake was approximately 48%. I pulled up to the familiar suburban house at 12:58 p.m. James's new Tesla was already in the driveway. Of course it was. He'd spent the last 6 months making sure everyone knew about his successful car dealership manager position and the lease he could now afford. Inside, the house smelled like turkey and disappointment. "Oh, you actually came," Mom said when I walked in, not looking up from the potatoes she was mashing. "I half expected you to cancel. You've been so distant lately." "Just busy with work," I said quietly. James appeared from the living room, beer in hand, wearing a polo shirt with his dealership's logo. "Work?" He laughed loudly. "Is that what we're calling it? How's the coding going, little brother? Built any good apps lately?" "It's going fine," I said simply. "Fine," James repeated mockingly. "Everything's always fine with you. Meanwhile, some of us have actual careers. Actual responsibilities." He gestured to himself. "I just got promoted to senior sales manager. 36 cars sold last month. But hey, you keep playing with your computer." I nodded and moved toward the kitchen to help Mom. Aunt Linda and Uncle Robert arrived at 1:15. Followed by my cousin Michelle and her husband Brad. The living room filled with the usual pre-dinner small talk, and I knew what was coming. It always came. "So, David," Aunt Linda said with that particular tone of false interest. "What are you up to these days? Still doing the computer thing?" "Still working in tech," I confirmed. "Tech," Uncle Robert said with a dismissive snort. "Everyone's in tech these days. What does that even mean? Are you programming websites? Fixing computers? Something like that." James jumped in, unable to resist. "He works from home. Writes code for some startup that probably doesn't pay him. He's been doing this for 7 years now." He looked at me with exaggerated concern. "Dave, seriously, when are you going to get a real job? You're 32. Most guys your age have careers, families, houses." "I'm comfortable where I am," I said evenly. "Comfortable," Michelle laughed. "Is that what we're calling barely scraping by?" He turned to Brad. "David lives in this tiny apartment in the most expensive city in America. No idea how he affords it." "Rent control," I said, which was technically true. I'd stayed in the same apartment even after the company took off because it felt dishonest to move while keeping secrets from my family. Though the $2.8 million in my personal checking account could have bought the entire building. Mom called everyone to dinner at 2 p.m. The dining room table was set formally with the good china that only came out for holidays. I ended up seated between Aunt Linda and cousin Michelle, directly across from James, who'd positioned himself at what he clearly considered the power position next to Dad. Dad arrived late from his consulting firm's emergency meeting, still wearing his suit. He was a senior partner at a mid-tier consulting company and had spent my entire childhood reminding me that real success means stability, benefits, and respect. "David's here," Mom announced as Dad sat down. "Surprisingly. Good," Dad said curtly. "Maybe this year he'll have some actual news to share. Some progress report on his life." The turkey was carved. Plates were passed. And then it started. "So David," Dad said loudly, commanding the table's attention. "Your mother tells me you're still working on your computer projects. How's that going?" "It's going well," I said. "Well," Dad repeated. Interesting word choice. Does well mean you're making money? Supporting yourself? Building towards something? "I support myself just fine." James laughed into his wine glass. "Define fine. Because from where I'm sitting, you've been doing the same thing for almost a decade with nothing to show for it." "James sold 36 cars last month," Mom interjected proudly. "And he's being considered for regional manager." "That's great," I said genuinely. "Is it though?" James leaned forward. "Is it great, or are you sitting there judging us for having normal jobs while you chase some pipe dream?" "I'm not judging anyone." "You never are," Aunt Linda said. "You're always so quiet about everything. So secretive. It makes people wonder what you're hiding." "Maybe he's embarrassed," Michelle suggested. "I would be too if I was 32 and still hadn't figured out my career." Uncle Robert cut in. "When I was 32 I had a mortgage, 2 kids and a management position. What do you have, David?" "An apartment and a laptop." "That's pretty much it," I agreed. "See." James gestured dramatically. "This is the problem. You've got no ambition. No drive. You're content to just exist in this weird tech bubble, pretending you're building something important." "He's not pretending," Mom said defensively. "He's just trying different things." "For 7 years?" Dad's voice cut through the chatter. "At some point, trying different things becomes failing to commit." "David, I'm going to be blunt because someone needs to be. You're wasting your prime earning years. You should be establishing yourself, building a 401k, getting on a career track. Instead, you're playing around with code in an apartment you probably can't actually afford." "I can afford it," I said quietly. "Can you?" James challenged. "Bez, I've done the math. Tech jobs in San Francisco pay decent money, but you've never mentioned a salary. You've never talked about benefits or stock options or anything that would indicate a real position. So either you're embarrassed about what you're making, or you're not making anything at all." The table went quiet. Everyone was looking at me, waiting for me to defend myself or break down or finally admit what they all believed. That I was a failure. I took a sip of water. "I'm doing fine." "Fine." James exploded. "Everything is always fine with you. You know what? I'm sick of it. I'm sick of you coming to these dinners and saying nothing, contributing nothing, just sitting there like you're above it all while the rest of us have real lives." "James, that's enough," Mom said weakly. "No, it's not enough." James pulled out his phone. "You want to know what triggered this? I'll tell you. I was looking at LinkedIn this morning and I saw David's profile. He's got himself listed as founder and CEO of some company I've never heard of. Neuralink something. And I thought, here we go again. Another fake title. Another fantasy." He turned his phone toward the table, showing my LinkedIn profile. "Founder and CEO," he read mockingly. "Of what? A company that doesn't exist? A startup that's been starting up for 7 years? This is what I mean. You're not building anything. You're just pretending on the internet." "It exists," I said calmly. "Oh, it exists," James repeated with exaggerated belief. "Then why has nobody ever heard of it? Why aren't you rich? Why are you still living like a college student?" "I like my apartment." "You like your apartment," Dad said with disappointment dripping from every word. "David, do you hear yourself? You're 32 years old. You should like your house, your career, your accomplishments, not your rental apartment." Aunt Linda reached over and patted my hand with theatrical sympathy. "Honey, we're not trying to be mean. We're concerned. 7 years is a long time to be working on something with nothing to show for it. Maybe it's time to consider that this particular path isn't working out. Maybe get a job at Google or Facebook," Michelle suggested. "Those companies hire programmers, right? At least then you'd have stability. A real salary." "I'm not looking for another job," I said. Of course you're not, James sneered. Because that would require admitting failure. And we can't have that, can we? Can't have perfect David admit that his big dream didn't work out. I've never claimed to be perfect. No, you just sit there silently while everyone else shares their lives, their successes, their struggles. You contribute nothing to this family except awkward silences and vague answers about your work. Uncle Robert cleared his throat. James might be coming on strong, but he has a point. Your family, David. We care about you. And watching you spin your wheels for 7 years has been difficult. At some point you need to face reality. What reality is that? I asked. That you're not a tech entrepreneur, Dad said flatly. You're a smart kid who dropped out of a PhD program and convinced himself he could build something from nothing. But the statistics are clear. 90% of startups fail. You've been working on this for 7 years with nothing to show for it. No press releases. No funding announcements. No success stories. Just a LinkedIn profile that claims you're a CEO. Maybe he is a CEO, Mom offered weakly. Just of a very small company. James laughed harshly. A company of one. That's called being unemployed with delusions of grandeur. The words hung in the air. I could see the agreement on their faces. This was what they all believed. What they'd probably always believed. When are you getting a real job? Aunt Linda asked again, more gently this time. There's no shame in admitting something didn't work out. We'd all support you if you decided to pursue something more realistic. This is realistic, I said. Is it? James leaned back in his chair. Then prove it. Show us something. Anything. A funding announcement. A client. Anything that proves this isn't just a 7-year fantasy. I don't need to prove anything. Of course you don't, Dad said coldly. Because you can't. And we're tired of pretending otherwise. Every year we sit here and dance around the truth because we don't want to hurt your feelings. But someone needs to say it. You failed, David. Your startup didn't work out. And the sooner you accept that and move on, the sooner you can start building a real life. The silence after Dad's words was absolute. This was the moment they'd all been building toward. The intervention they'd apparently all agreed on before I arrived. I started to say. The living room TV suddenly erupted with the CNN breaking news sound. Mom had left it on low volume in the other room, but the urgent tone made everyone turn their heads. We interrupt your regular programming for breaking news in the tech sector, the anchor announced. Someone turn that down, Dad said dismissively. But Michelle was already walking toward the living room, curious. Then she stopped dead in the doorway. Her face went completely white. Oh my God, she whispered. What? James asked, annoyed at the interruption of his triumph. Michelle couldn't speak. She just pointed at the TV. James got up, irritated, and walked to where he could see the screen. He froze exactly like Michelle had. That's not, he started. That can't be. The CNN anchor's voice carried clearly into the dining room. Tech innovator David Chen's NeuralSync Technologies launches highly anticipated IPO tomorrow morning, with initial valuations reaching $3.2 billion. The brain-computer interface company has been operating in stealth mode for 7 years. My LinkedIn photo appeared on the screen. The same photo James had mocked 5 minutes earlier. The entire family rushed to the living room. I stayed seated at the dining table, calmly cutting my turkey. The 32-year-old Stanford dropout, the anchor continued, has been working in secrecy from a small San Francisco apartment, developing revolutionary technology that could change how humans interact with computers. Dave. Mom's voice was barely a whisper from the living room. Dave. I took another bite of turkey. It was actually pretty good this year. Chen's company has secured $847 million in funding from top venture capital firms. The anchor explained as B-roll footage showed our office building in Palo Alto. The one I went to every day but had never mentioned to my family. The IPO is expected to make Chen one of the youngest billionaires in the technology sector. James appeared in the doorway to the dining room. His face had gone from smug satisfaction to absolute shock. That's you. On CNN. They're saying you're worth about $1.54 billion on paper, I said calmly. Once the stock opens tomorrow. Though the valuation could go higher or lower depending on market conditions. Dad pushed past James, his phone already out, frantically typing. NeuralSync Technologies. Brain-computer interfaces. Series D funding of $847 million. The reports are real. This is, you actually. Aunt Linda appeared, her face pale. You've been working on this? For 7 years. And you never said anything? You never asked what I was actually working on, I pointed out. You just assumed it was nothing. My phone started buzzing. Text messages pouring in from colleagues, investors, friends who'd watched the coverage. I silenced it and returned to my dinner. Michelle was crying quietly in the doorway. We said all those things. And you were building a company, I finished. Yes. James had his phone out now too, scrolling through articles that were exploding across every tech news site. Forbes has you listed as one of tomorrow's new billionaires. TechCrunch is calling Neuralink the most important IPO of the year. Bloomberg says. He looked up at me, devastated. Why didn't you tell us? Would you have believed me? I asked simply. The question hung there. Everyone knew the answer. If I'd told them 3 years ago that I was building something revolutionary, they would have laughed. If I'd mentioned funding rounds or valuations or partnerships, they would have assumed I was lying or delusional. They'd proven that today, calling my LinkedIn profile a fantasy. The news says you've been working in stealth mode, Uncle Robert said slowly. That was deliberate. You could have told us but chose not to. I chose to focus on building something real rather than defending myself to people who had already decided I was a failure, I said. It seemed more productive. Dad sank into his chair at the head of the dining table. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in the last 5 minutes. You let us believe you were struggling. You sat through years of dinners where we questioned your choices, your career, your life. You never once defended yourself. Would my defense have mattered? I asked. Or would you have just found new ways to doubt me? Silence. Mom's phone rang. She answered it automatically, still in shock. Hello. Yes, this is Margaret Chin. You're from Canaan. You want to interview me? About David. She looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Fear mixed with confusion, mixed with something that might have been pride if it wasn't so contaminated with shame. I need to call you back, she said and hung up. They want to interview you, I said. All of you probably. About what it was like watching me build Neuralink. About how the family supported my journey. That's usually how these stories go. James let out a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. Supported your journey. Jesus Christ. We called you a failure. To your face. Today. I called you a failure today. Yes, I acknowledged. And you just sat there. You didn't defend yourself. You didn't tell us. You just... He couldn't finish the sentence. My phone buzzed again. This time I glanced at it. A text from my communications director. CNN wants to do a family segment. Should I arrange it? I typed back, no. Aunt Linda had found a chair and collapsed into it. This is real. This is actually happening. You're actually, and we just spent an hour telling you to get a normal job. Oh God, what did we do? You shared your honest opinion, I said calmly. Which is what family dinners are for, right? Honest communication. The sarcasm wasn't lost on anyone. Dad's phone rang. He looked at the caller ID and his face went even paler. It's my firm's senior partner. He answered. Hello, Richard. Yes, I'm watching the news. Yes, that's my son. You want to discuss consulting opportunities with Neuralink? I don't think. He hung up looking sick. They want me to leverage my relationship with you to get your company as a client, he said quietly. They're calling it the opportunity of a lifetime. For them. For the firm. What did you tell them? I asked. That I'd discuss it with you. He looked directly at me for the first time since the news broke. Will you discuss it with me? Why would I do that? I asked simply. You just spent the last hour explaining that I have no accomplishments, no real career, nothing to show for 7 years of work. Why would someone like that be in a position to help your firm? The words landed like physical blows. David, Mom said desperately. We didn't know. If we had known. If you had known, you would have treated me completely differently, I finished. You would have been proud, supportive, interested in my work. But you didn't know, so instead you spent 7 years making me feel like a disappointment at every single family gathering. The question is, which version of you is real? The one that respects success after it's proven? Or the one that supports family unconditionally? Nobody answered. Michelle's husband Brad, who had been silent throughout the entire dinner, spoke up carefully. For what it's worth, I always thought you were working on something interesting. You had that focus. That intensity. Thank you, Brad, I said. But you also never once asked me about it or defended me when others attacked my choices. So your observation is noted but not particularly meaningful. He flinched. James sat down heavily at the dining table, his head in his hands. I texted you this morning. I told you to stop pretending to be successful. That it was embarrassing the family. I remember, I said. And you responded that you'd see me at 1 p.m. You didn't correct me. You didn't defend yourself. You just let me believe. What you wanted to believe, I finished. Yes. Why? He asked desperately. Why let us go on thinking you were a failure? Because I learned something important over the last 7 years, I said, setting down my fork and looking around at all of them. I learned that the people who truly support you don't wait for proof of success to offer respect. They don't need to see you on CNN to believe in you. They trust you because they know you, not because Forbes validates your worth. Mom was crying openly now. We do know you. You're our son. Our brother. Do you? I asked. Because you spent 7 years thinking you knew me and you were completely wrong. You assumed. You judged. You mocked. And at no point did any of you stop to think that maybe, just maybe, I knew what I was doing. Dad's voice was barely audible. What do you want from us? Nothing, I said honestly. That's what I've wanted for 7 years. Nothing except to be left alone to work on something I believed in. And that's still what I want. Aunt Linda looked stricken. You're not going to forgive us? We made a mistake. We didn't understand. You made a choice, I corrected. You chose to believe the worst about me despite having no actual evidence. You chose to mock instead of support, to question instead of trust, to assume failure instead of giving me the benefit of the doubt. Those were choices, not mistakes. My phone buzzed with another text. My CFO, stock market is going crazy with anticipation. We're trending on every platform. You should see the pre-market numbers. I glanced at the message and smiled slightly. What? James asked desperately. What is it? Nothing important, I said. Just work. The TV was still playing, now showing an extended segment about NeuralSync's technology and its potential applications. The anchor interviewed a Stanford professor who explained how revolutionary our brain-computer interface was. The segment included testimonials from early users who'd had their lives changed by our technology. That's what you've been building, Uncle Robert said, watching the TV. That's what we called a hobby. Yes, I confirmed. And the apartment you live in? The one we thought you could barely afford. I own the building, I said casually. Bought it 2 years ago as an investment property. Though I still live in the same unit because, like I said, I like it there. Mom made a sound like all the air had left her body. The Tesla in James's driveway, I continued, cost about $87,000. My company's annual revenue last year was $340 million. I'm not telling you this to brag. I'm telling you this so you understand exactly how wrong you were. About everything. James looked at his keys on the table like they were suddenly made of cardboard. So what happens now? Michelle asked quietly. You're going to cut us out of your life? Never speak to us again. I'm going to finish my dinner, I said, and then I'm going to drive back to San Francisco. Tomorrow morning I have an IPO to manage. Next week I have meetings with Fortune 500 companies about integrating our technology. Next month I'm speaking at a tech conference in Singapore. And through all of that I'll be doing exactly what I've been doing for 7 years. Working on something I believe in regardless of what anyone else thinks. And us? Dad asked. Where do we fit in? I looked at him steadily. I don't know yet. That's something I'll need to think about. Because right now I'm having trouble reconciling the family that raised me with the family that spent 7 years convinced I was a failure. And I'm not sure which one is real. The silence that followed was broken only by the TV anchor introducing another segment. Coming up, how David Chen became a billionaire while living like a college student. The remarkable story of stealth success. I stood up, my dinner finished. Thank you for having me. The turkey was excellent. David, wait, Mom pleaded. You can't just leave. We need to talk about this. We need to. What you need to do, I interrupted gently, is think about how you treat people before you know their net worth. Because the way you treated me tonight, that's who you really are. And the way you're treating me now after CNN? That's just damage control. I grabbed my jacket from the coat rack. Will you come to Christmas? Mom asked desperately. I don't know, I said honestly. I'll let you know. James stood up suddenly. I'm sorry. God, David, I'm so sorry. Everything I said, everything I've said over the years, I was wrong. I was completely wrong. You were honest, I corrected. That's actually worse. Because if you'd been wrong, that would mean you knew the truth and said something false. But you weren't wrong from your perspective. You genuinely believed I was a failure. And that tells me everything I need to know about what you think of me when the cameras aren't rolling. I walked toward the door. Your father and I are proud of you, Mom called out. We always have been. I paused at the threshold and turned back. No, you haven't. You've been embarrassed by me, confused by me, worried about me, but proud. That's a new emotion for you, and it only showed up about 20 minutes ago when CNN provided external validation of my worth. That's not fair, she protested. Isn't it? I looked around at all of them. If the news hadn't broken today, what would have happened? You would have continued this intervention. You would have spent the rest of the evening trying to convince me to give up and get a real job. And I would have driven home knowing that my own family saw me as a failure. That's what would have happened. Don't rewrite history just because reality turned out differently than you expected. I opened the door. The late afternoon air was cool and crisp. David, Dad said, and his voice cracked. What can we do? How do we fix this? I considered the question carefully. I honestly don't know if you can. Because the problem isn't what you said today. The problem is that you believed it. For 7 years you believed I was wasting my life. And nothing I said or did convinced you otherwise. You needed CNN to change your mind. What does that say about us? I didn't wait for an answer. I walked to my car, a modest Honda Civic that I'd been driving for 6 years. The same car that James had once mocked as sad compared to his leased Tesla. As I pulled away from the curb, I could see them all standing in the doorway watching me leave. They looked shell-shocked, devastated, like their entire understanding of reality had been rearranged in the span of 20 minutes. Good, I thought. Now they knew how it felt. My phone rang as I merged onto the highway. My co-founder Sarah calling to check in. How'd it go? She asked. About how I expected, I said. Did you tell them before the news broke? No. I wanted to see what they really thought of me. Turns out I was right to keep my distance. She was quiet for a moment. You sound calm. I am calm, I said. I made peace with their opinion of me years ago. Today just confirmed what I already knew. They never believed in me. They believed in success. And those are very different things. Are you going to reconcile with them? Maybe, I said. Or maybe not. Right now I'm going to focus on the IPO, on the company, on the work. The family stuff can wait until I'm ready to deal with it. If I ever am. Fair enough, Sarah said. For what it's worth, we believed in you. The whole team. We always have. I know, I said. That's why we succeeded. Because we surrounded ourselves with people who didn't need CNN to tell them we were building something real. I hung up and drove through the fading light toward San Francisco, toward my apartment, toward the life I'd built despite everyone's doubts. Behind me, my family was probably still standing in that doorway trying to process what had happened. Trying to figure out how they'd gotten it so wrong. But that was their problem to solve. I had an IPO to launch.